Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening to those of you in the room. Good evening to those of you joining on Zoom. My name is Joseph Cronin. I'm the director of the Baeck Institute, London. This evening, I'm delighted to say we have a three-way collaboration between us, the LBI London, our regular partners in our annual lecture series, the German Historical Institute, London, this I should say second of four in our lecture series, and the German Historical London is represented here by Dr. Michael Scheich, who will say a few words after me, and we also have this evening a new collaborating partner joining us, which is the British-German Association, represented here tonight by its chair, Peter Barnes, and by Dr. Tamara Berlo. And Peter Barnes will say a few words after Michael. So, without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Dani Kranz. Professor Kranz is an applied anthropologist who currently holds the DAAD, in case you don't know, that's German Academic Exchange Service, Humboldt Professorship at El Colegio de México, I can't pronounce Spanish, sorry, in Mexico City. Professor Kranz is a truly interdisciplinary and academic with training in anthropology, social psychology, history, cultural studies, and Jewish studies. Her thematic expertise covers migration, integration, ethnicity, law, state dynamics, political life, organizational studies, and memory politics. And she's conducted field work both in Europe and in the Middle East. Professor Kranz's current research investigates moral economies, Jewish life, and the fight against anti-Semitism. An important project which she's currently working on in conjunction with Sarah Ross is called Knowledge Architectures, mapping structures of Jewish heritage processes on communal, organizational, and academic levels in post-1945 Europe. Professor Kranz has also recently published an important authored book about the migration of Israelis to Germany since 1990. She also serves as a consultant to the High Commissioner of the German government for Jewish life and the fight against anti-Semitism. She's also a member of the Council for Migration and collaborates with various foundations, museums, and NGOs. So I'm not going to welcome her just yet. I'm going to hand over to Dr. Michael Scheich, Deputy Director of the German Historical Institute.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. And I also want to welcome you very warmly on behalf of the German Historical Institute. Good to see you here in the room, and thanks for joining us online. The LBI and the German Historical Institute have been co-organizing this lecture series, I think, for almost 15 years now. And it's always a pleasure to work with Joe and his colleagues, and I want to thank everyone who's involved in organizing tonight's events and putting it together very warmly. I think it's a very worthwhile collaboration. But I think it's not exaggeration to say that this lecture series has become a very important forum for debates about Jewish culture and history. And given what we have seen over the last months or even years, I think it's really important to have these spaces for open communication, for sound information, and for debate. And I think tonight's lecture is a particularly good example of what the series hopes to achieve and hopefully also can achieve. And I want to thank Professor Dani Kranz for accepting our invitation and for going to the trouble to come to London and to speak to us. It's really much appreciated, and we are very much looking forward to what you're going to tell us. And finally, I want to thank the British German Association for co-hosting tonight's events. We have been working on a number of occasions in the past together. So glad to see you again, Peter, and thank you for joining up with us and the LBR. I'm acutely aware that we have more words of welcome than usual, so I think I'll finish and stop here and hand over to Peter, who's going to say a few words on behalf of the BGA. Peter.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Joe, for the invitation. I'm also very much looking forward to hearing what Professor Kranz has to say. It's a particular personal pleasure to be able to do this event this evening with the Baeck Institute London, because I have a very long-standing personal connection with the late Professor Peter Kulzer, who was a seminal chair of the Baeck Institute London over many years. In the brief interval between Kristallnacht and the outbreak of war, Peter and his family were sponsored to come to England by my grandmother, who was the wife of a country clergyman and very concerned about developments in Nazi Europe and wanted to do what she could to help. And that started a lifelong friendship between Peter, his sister, and my parents. And when I went to Oxford to study PPE, Peter taught me a special paper on German politics and inspired me to spend my 2 summer holidays at university in Germany, which was the beginnings of a lifelong interest in Germany, and inspired me when I had the chance to play a role at the British German Association. And it was a great pleasure to be able to welcome Peter in one of his last years to give a lecture to the British German Association on the impact of Jewish emancipation around 1870. Like many Nazi-era immigrants to the UK, Peter played an enormous role in British public life after the Second World War, but also, like many of those immigrants, despite significant honours from both Germany and Austria, he never returned to his country of origin. And I think one of the things I'm looking forward to hearing tonight from Professor Kranz's lecture is why Germany in particular was relatively unsuccessful in persuading a number of the people who've been forced out of Germany in the 1930s, or their children, to return to Germany in the decades following the war. So thank you very much indeed for allowing the British German Association to be part of tonight's event, and I look forward very much to hearing what Professor Kranz has to say.
You should have been involved in me.
Well, thank you, and thanks for the introduction. It's actually easier if I sit, so it's easier for me to go through the slides. And if you have questions, feel free to interrupt me. I'm actually very happy to be here. So it's not exactly a drain coming to London. And I mean, I didn't flee Germany, obviously. However, many Jews of the 3rd generation actually left for the UK, and I was one of them. And back in the day when I came, it was like the heyday of the European Union, and actually most of us were offered British citizenship. So I do have a vast appreciation for the British university system, which I met back in the day, which is sadly now falling apart, and also for the offer of citizenship, which I took up. And I mean, Joe actually mentioned all of the stuff where I'm active. I'm actually a board member of the now founded Association of Jewish Academics of Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, because we felt very strongly that post October 7th, we needed a kind of representation, because the amount of anti-Semitism that actually goes around in the academic system is both scary, and it is when I think for many of us, it actually came as a shock. We hadn't quite expected the vitriol that was going to come our way, and this way the non-distinction between a country, its people, and all sorts of other messages. And we left Mexico slightly earlier because we shared the last name with the Israeli ambassador. So the amount of hate mails that I received actually shot through the ceiling. And that was something which was really completely shocking and new. However, Now I'm introducing you to the much more, kind of cheery topic of Jews post-1945 Germany. They're actually quite interesting bunch. Joe worked on them as well. He worked on Russian speakers. And Anthony Kauder sadly is not here because he worked on the community between 1945 and 1990. So basically the old community I grew up in. And I'm going to give you an overview. So the first thing is this slide. Can any of you read it? It's Hebrew script, but it's not Hebrew. We go back to it at the very end. So this was actually made by a Berlin-based Israeli artist and is written in the native language of her mother. But when you look at it, because I stumbled over it, it was only when I was able to read the third word that I somehow started grasping what it is. But I couldn't properly read it either. So any of you knows what it is? Or anyone who wants to guess? Okay, good. Then we're going to continue for now. Okay, the rough overview I'm going to give you is the community post-1945. And by community, I actually mean all of those who lived in Germany and who self-identified as Jews, because the Jewish community itself has pretty stringent entrance or entry criteria. And not every Jew can be a member, and not all Jews obviously want to be members. You are no way forced to be member of any religious community in Germany. But the first generation and structures that came into being after 45, then the second generation, intergenerativity. So that's the major topic, the third generation and diversity. And then what we now have is the fourth generation, which is growing up in a very diverse country, gay, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, but as well very, very polarized. And it's actually no accident that I capitalized first and second, but not third and fourth, because first and second, by that I actually mean the survivors, and by the second generation, the children of the survivors, because it was a much more homogeneous Jewish community than it is now. And that, of course, raises the question, which for me as an anthropologist is interesting, what actually constitutes a generation? And as well, is there something like a lived normalcy of Jews in Germany, and what kind of Jewish, non-Jewish relations can be observed, and what is the impact of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which actually has now shown very, very much. So the post-1945ers, so that's actually then the first generation, about 15,000 Jews survived in Germany itself, most of them actually by way of intermarriage. And before the community membered about 500,000. I mean, the figures are if you look at several publications, that's roughly the figures you get. It might be slightly more or slightly less. And these 15,000 Jews of German descent, some of them actually became members of the communities. Many became non-members because they didn't want to appear on any list ever again. And that's actually something which I found repeatedly in field work. These, you could say, few survivors were actually joined by a much larger number of Jews of Eastern European descent, which fled from Eastern Europe to the British and the US occupied zones, where you have the biggest where you had the biggest Jewish communities in former West Germany. And at their height, about 250,000 displaced persons lingered in DP camps. Most of them left the country. The structures that this first generation set up was the Central Council of the Jews of Germany, der Zentralrat der Juden in Deutschland, and it's important this Central Council of the Jews in Germany as opposed to German Jews. So you see a very strong distinction and distancing mechanism, which was founded in 1950. And it was actually joined of the structures which displaced persons, Eastern Europeans, and Jews of German descent or German Jews had set up. And the first survey that we have is actually from 1955 only, and there you can see the number is 15,920, and there you get the first glimpse that not all of those surviving German Jews wanted to be members, and that obviously most of the Jews who were in the DP camps either were leaving or had already left. They never became members. And the figures that we have until very recently are always based on membership, which means as well there's an undercount of Jews in Germany due to the issue of not all Jews being members, or not everybody by way of self-identification being able to be a member. Similar numbers do not exist for the GDR. We have some figures, but because the membership criteria were different, they're actually you're comparing that apples with pears. So this is pretty much the structures which prevail today, because the Central Council of the Jews of Germany, which presides over the unified communities, is still the major body, and the communities which actually are adjacent to it are the ones with the highest membership. So the question is, of course, how do these Jews live? In the West, the board members of the first communities were usually German Jews, and the reason is, you could say, is as practical as it was banal, because German Jews spoke German, they had connections to other Germans, they could actually set up a community. At the same time, the Eastern Europeans did not really want to be involved that much with the German, with the majority German community, which they, you could say, residents, because for them, Germany and Germans were very strongly related to the Shoah, so there was a very strong boundary. So the outside representation were initially German Jews, and the majority of them were married to non-Jews. I think the figures that Anthony Kauder says, it's about 75% of the board members were married to non-Jews. And when you look at the research that was conducted, and I think historiographically, that's very interesting to look at. Alfons Silbermann and Harry Maor, already at the end of the 1950s, they began their research. They conducted the first empirical research amongst the members of the communities. There you have the issue again, you catch the community members, but not the other ones who were around. And they were sociologists, and they looked at issues which were important to Jews. And Alfons Silbermann, already in 1972, wrote an article that the interests of the Jewish researchers were very different from the German non-Jewish ones, because the German non-Jewish ones were pretty much fixated on the past, whereas the Jewish sociologists, and I mean there's a difference as well in the profession, that they were mainly interested in the issues that were pressing for the Jewish community. So cultural heritage was brought up by Silbermann already in 1960, and Maor brought up in 1961 the differences between the surviving generation, the very young second generation, and as well, bless you, and as well the unwillingness of the second generation to remain in the country. And these topics that they covered concerned identity practice, identity politics, community and social life, and as well Jewish, non-Jewish relations. Anthony Kauder's actually from 2003 on, that's his first publications on the topic, covers the ethno and the social history of that community. And he did also work on the issue of guilt, because he was very clear that guilt was actually what united that pretty much that small Rum community, and that was what he could as well gather from archival materials. However, the issue of trauma, which was ever present, was an issue that in particular the second generation of researchers dealt with, and those were in particular Kurt Grünberg, he did actually do loads of work on it, and Lena Iloblotsky, and both of them are children of survivors. And they looked at the life wars that they were actually confronted with, because the second generation had to create a completely new identity pretty much from scratch, because they couldn't go back to they couldn't really relate to their parents' identity praxis and as well spaces of identity. And they had to create something new, something very different. You could say something after destruction. And there's actually at least one second generation Jew who refers to herself as the first generation born after. It's very rare that second generations would do it. Usually the self-description is second generation, but she identifies as the first generation born after. It might actually be slightly surprising, but West Germany was always an immigration country for Jews since 1945. So the first Jews that came were obviously then the survivors who fled Eastern Europe. However, in Hamburg in particular, Iranian Jews settled from the 1940s onwards. Karen Kerber is currently conducting research on that. And you can see this kind of hidden immigration if you look at the membership figures and if you look at how many Jews left the country and who actually deregistered, what kind of citizenships they had, and who actually came into the country. It actually was loads of digging of statistics, but and because so many members of the second generation left, but the community numbers actually grew, and this was not a natural growth, so growth by way of birth, but a growth by way of immigration. Linda Babord actually conducted very interesting research which somehow touches on that topic as well, although she worked on friendship and love relationships of the second generation. And Micha Bodemann depicted a family history as a case study, and then you can actually track, or you can look, when you look at what they wrote, you can actually see how people moved, to what countries they moved, how circular migration happened, that people moved back and forth. So despite all of these anomalies, you actually had a constant immigration to Germany, and one of the, in terms of the figure of Jews, one of the largest concoctions that immigrated to Germany was actually from Israel. The thing is, they usually came on Israeli passports, so they appear in the statistics as Israelis. If they had any other citizenship or even German citizenship, often you can't ascertain, because even though they might have had German citizenship, they might have de-identified and used Israeli passports. So it's like when you look at any of those data sets, it's always the numbers only reveal part of the story. Loads of it is hidden, and loads of it often only comes out in interviews. So if you get your hands on any auto-ethnographic description such as diaries. So the pattern that becomes actually quite clear in terms of the research is that Jews actually work in living Jews, and that German non-Jewish researchers worked on dead Jews, on anti-Semitism, which was then at that point at least researched as a historical ill. Of course, that changed because not all research on anti-Semitism, which is conducted by non-Jews, is focusing on the past. So there's of course shifts. Then we have the big turning point, the Wende, which is actually the collapse of the Eastern Bloc and as well the Iron Curtain, because as a consequence, loads of post-Soviet Jews or Soviet Jews at that point, and from 1991, post-Soviet Jews actually left the Soviet Union. But as Joe actually argued very convincingly, and as well Yannis Panagiotidis, all of these post-Soviet migrations need to be seen in conjunction to each other, because it was not only Jews leaving, but it was as well ethnic Germans and all sorts of other people who could pretty much get out of the former Soviet Union by way of visas, of work migration, of whatever work to them. And when you actually talk to post-Soviets, the most interesting stories come out, how people actually switched categories, how they tried to leave. So the idea that has been pushed, that there was a desired reforestation of Jews from the side of the German state, doesn't hold when you look at historical data, because on the one hand, Jewish migration took part and was part of the post-Soviet migrations, and as well this legislation that the GDR had that would enable post-Soviet Jews or Soviet Jews and then post-Soviet Jews to actually obtain residence in Germany. It was very difficult to negotiate into the unification contract. So the idea that the Germans were standing there saying, "Oh, give us all of the Jews," is a bit of a misnomer. And it's actually quite interesting how a catchphrase then is being born, even though when you look at empirical data, which I tend to do, it's like it doesn't hold. So this quota refugee legislation that was passed and that became that was actually negotiated as part of the reunification treaty enabled 604 individuals to actually immigrate to Germany. Not all of those were Jews by way of Jewish law, and not all of those were Jews and all because the actual legislation that remains in place enables everybody who has at least one Jewish grandparent, including their spouse and their children, to immigrate to Germany. It was changed in 2005 on request of the Jewish community of the Einheitsgemeinde, which wanted to limit this immigration pretty much to Halachic Jews because they needed members for community. And the interesting thing is that even with the ongoing Russo-Ukrainian war, that has not been changed, sadly. Because by now, if you wish to obtain a quota refugee visa, the central welfare offices or the Jews of Germany need to approve of your application, and only then the Central Agency for Migration Issues will issue you with a visa. So you can see there's actually mismatches on several levels. And if you look at the current research work on post-Soviet Jews and as well on Russian-speaking Jews, which my friend and colleague Marina Zapritsky-Narum is doing, you can see how all of these categories at times collapse into one, how they fall apart, and as well how important the language politics have become. Because until the Russo-Ukrainian war, the Russian language was actually the binding glue between the post-Soviet immigrants, and now it's become very important if you actually speak Russian, if you speak Ukrainian, and people will code switch depending on the situation. And even while they are in Germany, they try to acquire Ukrainian language skills by way of identifying with Ukraine despite being Russian native speakers. So that's actually what the ongoing research and stuff she's looking at now. But to go back to the now historical parts, Daya Klingenberg, who came to Germany as a small child, actually outlined that despite better visa provisions, the Russian-speaking Jews were not welcome with open arms. So loads of them suffered downgrading and downskilling, and it was actually quite difficult to for many of them to arrive. And it is telling that the sorry, I'm still suffering hay fever. That the law to recognize foreign degrees and foreign professional qualifications was already passed in 2013. So until that point in time, anybody who actually came in from abroad had a very hard time getting their degree recognized. And you will find loads of former Russian doctors in particular, and then it becomes very gendered. If they're female, they're now at beauty parlors or nail studios. And if they're men, at best of times they work as in massage parlors. And you can guess the what that actually did to the perception of not being welcome, and as well what kind of struggle, because these are as well much lower paid positions that you can occupy. And the on top of it, actually, the post-Soviet immigrants triggered suspicion and surprise, and the notion that they actually forged their papers was quite widely spread. So at the same time, despite all of these suspicions, it is actually fair to say that the Jewish community would have withered away if those Russian, post-Soviet Russian-speaking quota refugees hadn't come. And that's actually something you can again look at when you look at figures. You see quite clearly in 1989, there were about 27,000 members of the Jewish communities in the West, and only 379 in the East. And then when you look at the figures 10 years later, you see that those without post-Soviet backgrounds in West Germany were only 17,000, so 10,000 either died or left. Most likely they died because the community was over-aging. And in East Germany, the community would have completely collapsed. So it's actually, you could say, it's like the post-Soviet Jews pretty much, they rescued the Jewish communities and Jewish life. Otherwise, everything would have collapsed at one point very fast. And these perspectives of these post-Soviet Jews are actually now being caught up. So they actually, the way that one had tried to integrate them, the way one had tried to settle them, what happened afterwards is something which is now actually research topics. And you can see how non-prepared Germany was for this migration and how much they did not expect for that many post-Soviet Jews to come, because these quota refugees were distributed by the Königsteiner Schlüssel, which was actually designed for ethnic Germans. And if you have ethnic Germans post-Second World War, they were German speakers. And they were actually distributed pretty much across the country, so that the carrying capacity is actually the terrible term in the terrible technical term of any community wouldn't be overstretched and overburdened, because if too many people arrive at the same time, the politics of hospitality collapse pretty fast. And if of course you distribute people who don't speak German, who need an infrastructure, who need people to talk to, who need a social life, by way of the same statistical figure, it doesn't quite work. And the moment they spoke enough German, they moved to, they started building communities. It's a regular clustering mechanism, which we can observe over and over again. And all of the issues, and I think that Joe's book is actually the most in-depth description and analysis between 1990 and 2015. He describes all of these issues that actually came up with trying to somehow grapple with this immigration, but then not being quite sure how to deal with it. And all of the issues in terms of life work, the stuff that's actually the stuff that Darja Klingenberg, and then this new and ongoing research by Marina Sapritskina, what they're actually getting at. And the new project that Marina, Anthony, Ina Schaum, and I are planning actually looks at conversion, because conversion is so far has been under-researched. It's always put in a psychological bracket, but the actual contribution of converts has never been properly assessed or appreciated. So post-Soviet Jews obviously converted as well. Loads of those who came from Ukraine, because they were the conversion process in Ukraine before they fled. So you can see it's ongoing research, and that's the stuff we're actually working on. And then we have the slightly wayward presence, because sometimes German politicians like to talk of Jews as presents, Judenheitsgeschenke, which I guess most Jews, including me, deeply resent, because I feel like, I'm a present, and unfortunately the receipt was lost. And it's as well, it deprives you very much of agency. So Israelis started arriving, actually they arrived throughout, but the numbers grew, and they were discovered by the media in way of 2011. And after the media hype, it was possible to obtain funding to research them, because there was actually we still to date don't have a single professoriate position which looks at contemporary Jewry, and we don't have any university which is dedicated to Israel studies. So when you look at the early publications in terms of media, so if you want to do media research, the hype was always, the number of Israelis was blown completely out of proportion. I mean, there were figures around that there's like 50,000 Israelis in Berlin. I mean, they might have visited as tourists, but 50,000 is really way much. So the total of the country is about 20,000. And it's actually today the only subgroup where we have reliable data for representative sample, which is what Uzi Redefon, Heinz Sünker, and I conducted. And we did as well, or what intrigued me in particular when I motivated Uzi to look at me in particular, was the myths and what we could actually see in the figures. So in the media, what was over-reported were artists, academics, and intellectuals. And when you look at the actual figures, you actually find a distortion that quite a lot of them exist, but that depends on the German funding structures, because in the short-term funding tries to pull those in, but it's non-sustainable. And then the next batch comes, and you have kind of an exchange, but those who actually come hope that they will actually get the foot in the door, and that they can remain in the country and obtain some sustainable position, which quite often doesn't happen. And that was actually something that intrigued us, that there was actually a kernel of truth in this kind of myth. And what Uzi and I did together as follow-up work of what I had done is that we looked at how this symbolic capital of Israeli Jewish immigrants in particular impacted Berlin. And then you can see a mechanism that actually because they're desirable as immigrants and they're desirable for specific qualities. And by way of the symbolic capital, it leads as well, or it contributes as well to the rise of living expenses and rents. Is quite intriguing how specific groups like artists bring then up the rent, but at the same time then they can't afford it anymore. It's actually when you go to Hackney, you can see that here in London as well. Because when I was a student here, nobody wanted to live there and there were lots of artists, and now it's so cool. I mean, now I hold a chair and I wouldn't be able to afford it. So it's like the ones who actually made the area interesting get outpriced, and that's a mechanism we see in Berlin as well. And this symbolic Jewish and symbolic Israeli Jewish capital is very much oversold. So what Uzi and I we look as well at ads of real estate companies. And there you had all sorts of as well praise of these wonderful immigrants. And I call these Israelis wayward presence because by way of them having grown up in a Jewish majority society, they do actually raise inconvenient questions. They do so very noisily, and they have absolutely no problem of getting into fights with other Jews in public, which for the German public tends to be quite amusing. And sometimes it's mind-boggling what people will say in public or on the internet. When I say, okay, the internet doesn't forget, but it's nevertheless, it's very interesting to look at. And despite all of what I presented to you, there's actually loads of stuff we don't know. So we don't have any coherent socio-demographic data sets. I don't think anybody from the JPR is here because those are the guys who usually have those. They have at least some of the data sets for Germany as well. And by way of the structure of the German academic system, it's like what I presented is mainly based on project funding. And that's very sad because if you don't have coherent funding, then you have researchers doing really good work, then they have the knowledge, and then they move on to some other topic because obviously they need to make a living. And by way of this, you could say gaps that exist in the knowledge. Quite often, when you look at first projects, then Jews are related to in terms of anti-Semitism, the Holocaust and Israel. And it's actually then striking that the actual experience of Jews and the aftermath of the Holocaust and their relationship to Israel have not been researched. So we do have an article by Anthony from 2008, which is historical data, West Straddle Jews and Israel. But in the present, how Jews actually relate to Israel, we don't know. We're trying to get funding. So if there's anybody from the BNBF, we're trying to get that money. And sadly, so those lacks of knowledge, which create then a vicious circle between academia and society, because the lack of knowledge actually perpetuates, is that Jews were very fast turned into smokescreens post October 7th, because the actual anti-Semitism against Jews broke loose before any warranted or not warranted Israeli military actions. And this is something which we can sadly prove by way of loads of statistical evidence and loads of what has been reported in terms of to the respective you could say usually it's actually psychological help or emergency psychological help. And what we see on the street, I would argue, is as well a proxy for German domestic policy, because Jews are then those smoke screens in that game, and because you don't know much of them, you project on them they're either really good or they're really bad, because they never seem to be particularly neutral. And I would say that German society as such, German majority society, has moved from this verdict of collective guilt to collective innocence, where everybody was allegedly related to some resistance fighter, to what I would call a post-guilt, because the current generation and the fourth generation of Germans, of course, they don't relate to collective guilt anymore. That's a generational shift, and that this post-guilt society doesn't know how to actually deal with the Middle East at all. And that, of course, isn't being helped by the lack of knowledge about living Jews or Israel, Palestine, or Palestinians for that matter. We actually, if I complain about the lack of research on Jews and on Israelis, we have exactly 5 sources on Palestinians in Germany. And this is the largest Palestinian community in Europe. So it's like, it's actually, I wish something would be done about it, and I hope something will happen. And I would actually say that what we are facing in Germany, this lack of empirical research, the lack of community studies, the lack of community surveys, which is actually common in the US and in the UK, is the long-term effect of the of genocide on science, because there were simply no Jews there, or not many were there, and those who were there, obviously they were dealing with different issues. And Liliane Weisberg looked at the professions, or she did for one paper, she looked at professions that the first and second generation would actually have. And these were typically professions where you actually had a return on investment, which is why you have more Jewish businessmen and lawyers in relation to the total of the population. It's not that they actually always thought they want to do that. It's more as well a matter of fact, you actually have a return on investment, and the same goes for medical sciences. And if I'm an anthropologist, the jobs are actually quite rare. And I think besides me in Germany, probably one other Jew who I know is an anthropologist. But it's like, people who actually have to deal with the aftermath of genocide will actually they will try to get into professions where they actually make money. And what I hope is now that we will see a shift, that actually studies of contemporary Jewry will come into being alongside Judaic and Jewish studies, because they don't focus on contemporary Jewry. And I think we're now at the point in Germany where we need both, because the community in Germany is not that small. It's the 3rd largest in all of Europe. So we're trying to get the money, but so far we haven't gotten any from federal and state ministries. And actually the Ministry of the Interior has declined to fund the department which we wanted, and so has the Federal Ministry for Research and Education. And it's a very long process to actually wake up administrations and to make the point and to actually show why you need it. And I hope as well that as Peter, as the head of the British German Association, I hope there will be as well people who will go to German studies in the UK and that the language here won't die. And I hope that we will see some shifts in the academic systems, because it's actually knowledge we need to function as a society. We need that knowledge about living Jews, and as well we need modern languages, because otherwise we won't be able to actually to get into proper exchanges anymore. This is actually in German. I can translate it for everybody who doesn't speak any German, which is, I don't know. Do all of you speak German? No, I'm asking, I can translate it. Okay. It's actually a question which Alfred Bodenheimer, a very dear colleague from Switzerland, asked. And he asked the big question in regard to what is Jewish studies actually. So what he asked is like, is somebody doing Jewish studies who works on a specific geographical area or specific period, or who's working on a specific topic in regard to the history of Jews, but who doesn't actually know much about the religious, cultural, and linguistic specificities of Judaism. Or somebody doing Jewish studies who knows a lot about the traditional forms of Eastern European yeshivot, and who has high competences in this area, but in terms of cultural history and sociology doesn't really know much about the topic, and doesn't know how to actually work comparatively in regard to the Talmud, and who has never dealt with the creation of the Talmud. What does it mean that in the German-speaking areas, the majority of the students and as well of the lecturers are non-Jewish, whereas in the US, it's the opposite, and most of them are Jewish. So he's asking core questions of what is Jewish studies supposed to be, and I think he's getting at the very interesting topic of the issue of not only positionality, but also the questions we ask, because we always ask in front of our biographical backgrounds. And I would always argue that it's very important to have mixed teams and to actually have researchers of all sorts of backgrounds, because they ask very different questions, and that enriches sciences. So to finish, it's actually Jews have been obviously making demands in regard to Jewish studies and to their being in Germany in general. So it's actually the third and the fourth generation is quite outspoken in regards of demands towards the German state, which I would say comes as well from the issue most of them were actually born and raised in Germany, which is different to the first and the second generation. And there's a massive generational shift. In particular, the fourth generation, who are the kids as well of the post-Soviet Jews, they're born in Germany, so they don't suffer of the underprivileges of immigrants, but they're actually you could say they're natively born Germans, and that is a completely different mindset to having immigrated to, like what Daya Klingberg described, to see her parents suffer and to suffer economic hardship. So that generation doesn't suffer with anyone, particularly the fourth. And before October 7th, I would have actually argued there's something like normalcy, but that sadly actually blew up very much October 7th, when loads of structural anti-Semitism, and it seems to me a cultural reservoir of existing hate, actually came out, which was then, which is a hodgepodge of all sorts of Jew hate, but as well as a negotiation of German domestic policies and German foreign policies, and Jews became that smokescreen in this concoction. So it might sound strange, but I don't think that all of the people who voiced anti-Semitism actually know what they're actually talking about, that it's actually projections that are going on, which of course go at the expenses of Jews, because it's never in any way pleasant to be at the receiving end of hate. But I think we need to look very carefully of what is actually going on. And I've been trying to convince 3 of my colleagues who are education psychologists to look at the students who actually who are part of these encampments and protests, because I would guess that age is a parameter, and as well the lack of knowledge, and as well what is actually negotiated via Israel, Palestine, and the Middle East. So I hope that this is going to happen, but they were kind of reluctant. I mean, I get it why they didn't really want to touch it, but it's like I hope something like this is conducted either in Germany, the UK, or in the US, where we see loads of unrest. Well, actually, we have an encampment at Colmex as well, but our students hung up the Palestinian flag the wrong way around. So it's then it becomes difficult to take it serious, but at the same time, the amount of misinformation that they're spreading in general is quite strong. Okay, now I go back to the one which I showed you, the photo. So this is actually Greco-Judaic, and the third word, which I could figure out, is Ioannina. So what it says in Japanese, in this kind of in the language of the Romagnot Jews, is the equivalent to if I forget you, my Jerusalem, I will have forgotten everything. And this is the same in exactly this language, which I absolutely don't speak. But the mom of the artist assured that this is what it says. And yeah, Ioannina is the third term. Okay. I'm finished.
So much, Dani, for that.
Both incredibly wide-ranging and also very specific, or really, I'd sort of look at it that way. I think it really crammed a lot in, but in a way that was intelligible and really interesting. So we're going to open up to questions both from the room and from the Zoom audience. If you're watching on Zoom, you have the option either to type your question into the chat, or we can read it out, or if you prefer, you can raise your virtual hand. Raise your virtual hand and we will come around to you. Are there any questions from the room first of all? Please, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Baeck, for some really fantastically interesting talk, which told me a lot that I wasn't aware of, or really didn't be aware of before. I wonder if I could return to the question I alluded to in my introduction, as to, if I understood right, there were roughly 15,000 Jews in Germany that wore the same rough number in the census of 1955. And then you said that if there hadn't been the post-1990 immigration from Russia, the number would have dwindled further to around 11,000. So why was it that there weren't more of the German Jews who'd been forced to emigrate in the 1930s who then returned back to Germany?
I think it's a multitude of reasons. On the one hand, it depended on the age of those that immigrated, because those that emigrated at old age, those were most likely to come back. And it's actually where I find you can actually catch it, or you can actually capture it best, is that a significant amount of male German Jewish lawyers returned, but not females, because the women lawyers could only enter the legal profession later, and they were young at times of education, of graduation, and they could actually find good jobs abroad, whereas those who were actually already more seasoned then came back. So those who came back were usually those who were elderly, and the younger ones, I mean, if you look at the time that they had spent abroad, they'd settled, and then on top of it, I mean, they had suffered the worst discrimination, and obviously they saw that the people who were quite often in power were Nazi implicated, and that didn't make it attractive. I mean, you had to be pretty idealistic to come back. So it's as well not surprising that those who survived in intermarriages somehow stayed in the country, because they had a different relation, and there had been at least one German who had protected them. And for that generation, when you interview them, for them, this distinction between Jews and Germans doesn't make sense. And that's striking for those born after. It's a very clear distinction. It's a binary. So I think some of it is based on the economics, age of immigration, profession, and then as well, because those who immigrate who were younger than the ones who stayed, they formed families abroad, and then they didn't come back. I mean, I don't know if Nick Cortman is he listening online, because he's the one who worked on citizenship a lot, and in particular, the women who immigrated lost citizenship after marriage, and then it becomes even less attractive to go back. So it's a hard sell then to your spouse. It's like, no, we're going back to the country where they tried to murder me, and I don't have citizenship on top of it. It's structural, and I mean the first commissioners for restitution used to be in, I think, 7 out of the 11 Western states. They were German Jewish lawyers like Philipp Auerbach. Philipp Auerbach, Frenkel is the last name of one of them. And they lost their jobs already at the beginning of the 1950s when different actors tried to enter that scenery, who were much more interested in compensation for ethnic Germans who had been expelled. So I think it's all of that. It wasn't a welcoming country. I mean, we have restitution cases which are still going on. I mean, I'm not saying that Poland is any better on that one, but Polish Jews usually didn't. Not many went back. Not many.
Take another question from the room. We have a thriving Orthodox Jewish community here in Baden. Does that exist in Germany as well?
Interestingly, it's beginning to exist again because a significant amount of the refugees from Ukraine are actually Orthodox, and lots of them are actually part of the Chabad movement. So it's different to Stanford. Stanford is Hasidic, but it's coming into being again, which is fascinating because the amount of actual Orthodox Jews or Hasidim in Germany was always minimal. I mean, the thing is where there was no infrastructure. When you went out, all you could do is like eat salad from a bowl. So it's, but now it's changing.
There is someone on Zoom who has his hand raised. Tim Luckman, would you like to speak your question?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. A couple of points. In the late 1980s, I interviewed Gunther Ginzel.
Ah, yeah, he's a fellow Cologne Jew. I know him.
Yeah, and in that interview, he came back to a point which has it's puzzled me over the years, and I have various ideas, which is that he often led groups from America, particularly in Canada, and when they spoke to him, they did not want to know about German Jews. He emphasized this very strongly. I don't know whether this may have been because he felt that, or they felt that these people should have emigrated to Israel, or that it conflicted with their picture of the total genocide and the complete destruction, but they didn't want to hear about Jews who are still living in Germany. So that's one point which I will say is curious. And the second thing, the book by Ralph Giordano, the Second Guilt, the Zweite Schuld, which examines one of the themes in it is about how there were many layers, for instance, in the universities and the legal profession after the Second World War, who continued, or the Bundeskriminalamt, for instance, who continued to push what were, say, modified Nazi views or post-Nazi views. And so this ideology continued very strongly, and it takes generations to filter. And this is one of the reasons why, as you pointed out, there's something of a myth about the successful, the way the Germans supposedly successfully have dealt with their past, and led to the current wave of anti-Semitism. Thank you.
Fine. Yes, sure. And that's it. No, I mean, it's like, I know Gunther, and I mean, it's like, yeah, and Jews who came in from abroad weren't particularly keen on us. It's like, I mean, okay, stayed in the country, not particularly good, and in Israel, I mean, it's like speaking German in Israel. I had a friend who's a Polish native speaker, and she said that was even worse, so I'm not sure if that's, but yeah, obviously, it's like, it's trauma-induced. And yeah, I mean, like Giordano is like Second Guilt. Yeah, it's that's pretty much how it is. And I mean, it is where attitudes are transmitted within families, and obviously, if the families agree with Nazi policies, which a significant part of the German population did, then they transmitted that down the line. Of course, not everybody. I mean, family is not a death sentence, so if you don't agree with your family, you might as well break free. But I mean, I am actually still in shock after the election on Sunday, where the AfD won pretty much in the east of the country. I mean, then as a researcher, I'm wondering what has been passed down generations. I mean, actually, I find that pretty scary because they're so far on the right that the French and the Italian right wingers don't want to work with that.
Yeah, so thank you, first of all, for really very interesting lecture, which was also so self-reflective because you were also telling us how actually there is a lack of, empirical empirical knowledge that makes it often hard to reach very, very clear conclusions. There's a lot of hinting in the information or that makes everything actually a lot more complex. So thank you for that. But my question is actually, do you have any impressions of how what you call our fourth generation now, younger generation, and Jews living in Germany, or I guess the second generation post-Soviet Jews living there, how are they who are already very integrated? They were born, as you said, Germany, they speak German, they're faith German. How are they responding to this? I think it's a no way.
They're much more self-confident than previous generations, and they take action. It's actually impressive what these young people get together, and they I think they're much more self-conscious at the same time, and on top of it, their awareness context is much different, but because they benefited from more significant and more stable Jewish structures, their actual knowledge of Judaism and of Jewish issues is much better than that of the second and the third generation, because there's much more, and it's a much bigger group. It's like numerically, it's much bigger group, and it's and they I think this is it's impressive what they put up. I think it speaks of loads of self-confidence. Of course, some people will leave. I'm absolutely certain of that. And I hope that the trend that children go to schools in terms of their religious or ethnic belonging is not going to continue, that we have completely ghettoized schools. But the schools and the universities right now are one of our biggest problems, because schools are hotbeds for anti-Semitism, and because numerically these are a really tiny group, then when it comes to structures of bullying, then the smallest common denominator then is anti-Semitism. And loads of teachers don't feel equipped at all to deal with it. I mean, when I do teacher education, you can see the desperation. And that's why they have to convey all the contents to the kids, and at the same time, and they're supposed to deal with the Middle East conflict. I mean, if you have degrees in math and physics, how are you going to deal with that? So I think the schools will be very decisive as well in the Jewish future, and not necessarily the Jewish schools, of which actually we don't have that many. Yes, I see you at the back.
What a fascinating study, what we don't know. So much I don't know. All these different groups and identities and studies. All the names, many names you mentioned. Did you mention Heinz Stalitzky?
No, I didn't.
Is it not thanks to him that the re-establishment of the Berlin community was quite efficient? He survived Auschwitz, Dora Mittelbau, and then he was liberated in Bergen-Belsen. According to Pauline Pauker, the Paukers knew him well, and his second wife. He was, because of his experience, his really tough experience, he was a ready character, the ideal man to help rebuild the community in Berlin, because obviously he was working with some former Nazis who managed to get back, into high positions. And that he did an awful lot of good work. Also staying in Berlin, 1953, you mentioned the GDR. That is a month when 1,500 Jews fled East Germany because they were being persecuted.
Well, it was the time of the Slansky processes and all of the other unrest. Yeah, well, it wasn't that convenient being in Jerusalem. Yeah.
I traveled many times to the GDR, and people were very quiet about the idea of Jews, being separate from victims of fascism. They were all thrown into the same pot.
Yeah.
But are you aware that Honecker, who had been to France, he'd been to Greece, he had his state visit in the Kingdom of Sweden, he was desperate for recognition by the British and the Americans. And Gustav Bronfman visited him in Berlin. He was the chairman of the World Jewish Congress. He said, "You want to go to America? Where are your Jewish memorials? Because I have trouble far wide around the GDR." And then suddenly, there was this enormous building program. I don't know if you've been to Rostock. I mean, that must have cost a fortune. That was 1988. They had no people who worked on the buildings like I knew them. They could wait for weeks for materials to carry on with their work. And now all that was then transferred to building these memorials, which I thought was quite funny, really. It went through years. They had been completely ignored. And I haven't been to Germany since 2014. But I'm going in August because Arnold Zelinsky is celebrating his 90th birthday. He's still alive. I have worked very closely with him. He's written an awful lot about the Jewish problem and Jewish tasks in his novels. So I'll be interested to see what the mood and atmosphere is like. I know that many of my German friends of my age are very disillusioned with the German government. They think they made a real mess of things. But are you aware of Deborah Tiltman?
Yes.
I'm
a contemporary Jewish researcher, so yes, I'm aware of notes of my fellow Jews.
And very
whenever I might think of
in the Guardian about the war. But you see, the term anti-Semitism is always used. If I criticize Iran, I mean, I hate the brutal regime there. Am I anti-Muslim? And the word Zionism, you see, doesn't mean what it used to mean. It now means advocating a greater Israel beyond the borders of 1967.
No, I wouldn't go with that.
Because there are Jews. I mean, I have seen all the occupied areas when there was nothing there. And my grandfather said, all this land has to be given back. Often Jerusalem, which can become an international religious capital. And the Golden Heights, I've been to the top of the Golden Heights. From there you can see Damascus.
Yeah.
In an old soldier, I visited him. And what's this? The former professor at Oxford also said we must distinguish between what is now anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism.
So how would you define anti-Zionism?
I mean, I criticize Israel, but am I an anti-Semite?
Well, I have no criticism.
See, in the eyes of Secure Starmer, anyone who criticizes Israel is an anti-Semite.
By loads of Israelis do that, and I would call it anti-Semites and loads of Jews. And, I mean, as you mentioned, that the German government made a mess. I mean, British government, I'm not sure. I have 3 passports. I wouldn't say a particularly good government in any of them, including the UK.
Yeah.
So obviously I didn't vote that one.
We have got somebody on Zoom who works time. I think you'd like to ask the question for an audio. Oliver Fields. That's how I understood that you wanted to speak. Is that okay?
And the tone is on, so I should be here.
Well, yeah. Okay. Just lay it out, please. Okay. Which one? Please can you explain what we more about the DP cap until 1945?
It's echoing, but I can't really understand you.
Well, I was sounding that's the go on, you can do that.
That was screen.
Yeah, please.
Can you explain once more about the DP cap after 1945?
Want to know about the DP camps? That first part I didn't catch.
Yes, please.
Please, can you explain once more about the DP camps after 1945?
So I have the questions written down, so perhaps it would be easier if I. But thank you very much for your efforts. Can you explain once more about the DP camps after 1945? And I'll read the other questions for you, if you wish. Please can you expand on the connection between anti-Semitism and German social stratification? And finally, we would also like to follow up on sort of Dani Kranz's success stories. Can you suggest some for us to follow up?
Okay, Daya is actually very critical about those success stories, and she's very clear that the success stories that happen by way of support of teachers and single individuals. It wasn't that the German state was actually so supportive in general. German social stratification and anti-Semitism? You mean social stratification in terms of the stratification of the society, or you actually mean the different ethnic groups who reside in Germany? Because if you look at social stratification, I wouldn't say it's particularly anti-Semitism and social stratification don't actually have a positive relationship, because we can find anti-Semitism across all economic strata of society. What we can find is different forms of anti-Semitism in groups which have different ideological stances, and they have very Jews are projection screens and they're negative for them in very different ways. I mean, Jews can as well be projections or smoke screens for all sorts of positive emotions. So they're kind of Zygmunt Bauman coined the term allo-Semitism, of allos of the other in Greek, so that this other is always bequeathed with a specific value, never neutral and never a local. I'm not sure if that actually answered the question.
So interesting. Do we have more questions towards Lily?
I'm surprised you don't have any.
Maybe I just in das zu gesagt habe, every Jewish life in German television, I haven't seen German television for now 2 years now. I still remember the famous German crime series, Tatort.
Yes, and then it was a Tel Aviv.
Instead of the usual call, so could it maybe just comment on from your perspective how Jewish life is believed in German television?
Actually quite differently, because you have those Jews who are then depicted as the Orthodox Jews. You have the Orthodox Jews in Alles auf Zucker, which was screened on German TV. And the issue with depicting Jews is always like, are you making them visible or not? Because the majority of Jews in Germany is invisible because they're secular, so they don't actually wear any garb that would give away their Jewishness. They might wear Star of David or pendant in Hebrew, but it's not really that visible, and loads of Jews have names which are as well invisible. So the issue in films is always the issue of visibility, and then it depends at what point in time you're actually at what era you're looking at. So the Tatort Tel Aviv, I think, was they came out after 2015, which marked the what was the year? The 60th or the 60th or 60th? No, one of the anniversaries of German-Israeli diplomatic relations. And after that, there was a complete Tel Aviv hype. And at that point in time, you had those Tatorts, which then depicted regular Israelis, pretty much, Tatort Tel Aviv. But I would put those actually in the same bracket as the ones titled Istanbul or titled, I don't know, Thessaloniki, because it was pretty much they were part of this parcel, and the depictions of Jewish life tend to be quite diverse, different. They become stereotypical actually when it comes to features where it's like. I mean, there was this one feature, Jewish life after October 7th, and it's like everybody there was sort of Orthodox and visible. When I'm like, sorry, that's not what we have in our data sets. But then, I mean, Michael Budemann, quite that interesting term where he said, die lebenden Juden können nur enttäuschen. And he took enttäuschen, so the living Jews can only disappoint. But when you take it apart, enttäuschen, it's actually that it's a de-deception, because then you actually see the ones who are around, or it de-disappoint. So I think one of the core issues, and which is something which I always find interesting, is the notion of Jewish life should be more visible, but most Jews don't want to be visible, because it's simply not what they do in their everyday life. And on top of it, I think Jewish life, when it now comes, Jewish life should be more visible in schools, universities, or whatever. No, it actually should just be more bloody normal. So when you want your Jew who looks different? So I think you can see very different depictions. And in those features, I was surprised that the standard was like, is an Orthodox Jew, which is really a total minority. Insignia, like in terms of chains, that's actually quite common, but anything else, no.
Did you ever watch Freitagnacht Jews?
Ah, yeah. Do you want my wonderful opinion on that?
Right, okay.
They had really like a different way of young generation Jews talking to each other in a late night talk show.
Well, I mean, one of the Jews who were there were professional Jews. That was the first thing. And the second is like, it was Friday night Jews. And it was interesting that it said in German, Friday night Jews instead of Freitagnacht Juden, because apparently the term Jude you could put on the wall, which I found bewildering. And that is where the issue of it being Friday night. No halfway practicing Jew watches TV Friday night, and even if you're not practicing, you have your family in the house, so you can't actually enjoy the show of night. All sorts of individuals being around there. So it was an attempt, and it was actually interesting that the host said that he agreed to do it because at that point in time there was no other work. We'd say, okay, it's an honest opinion. I think it's, I mean, in any of those shows, you only see the professionals. I'm pretty sure if we did something like, I don't know, Friday Night Muslims, it's also, we would have a specific batch. So it was interesting. It was interesting to look at and to observe.
Yes.
Thanks for so many questions that you allow here. Now, Christians here and in Germany are, I would just say, secularizing in oodles really fast at the moment. So that means the global coming from religion, cohesion, is reducing. And how is that with Judaism, with Germany, with modern Jews there? And then I have a question about church tax, whether it probably isn't, and how the demographics are, whether the community is proliferating, whether there are lots of individuals or rather not like mainstream German stuff.
Well, because Judaism is not a religion, we have as well the quality of an ethnic group in it. So it's like you might be secular, but you might still self-identify as a Jew. So actually, I'm not aware of Jews who will refuse that identification. And the glue is not necessarily the religious practice as in a church or belief, but is a tradition. So that doesn't actually diminish. That's pretty stable. In terms of the amount of children, no, it's the same pattern as the German population. I mean, obviously, if you're observant, then you might have more children, or if you simply want more children. But they don't stand out in that regard. They don't. Right. And Kaltex, Kirchensteuer, Kaltex is actually, I mean, the original term is a church tax. It's if you are a foundation under public law, you can a specific amount of your income will then be taken immediately off your gross income and paid to whatever religious or worldview community you are a member of. And that applies to Jews, to the Catholic Church, Protestant, to I think there's 27 or 30 different recognized religious or worldview communities, because religion and worldview is equated under basic law, and Judaism is one of them. I mean, the question is now what is going to happen with Islam in Germany, and there was a huge hearing in the parliament today, because the state would, as well like as for the Jews, one central body, which is the Central Council for the Jews of Germany, but they're not representative of all Jews in the country. And for Muslims, then you have different, you have another batch of, you could say, problems that come with different streams, because putting Shia and Sunni and Alevis in the same community is never going to work. Whereas like for Christians, you actually have several Christian communities which are recognized. And it's a legal problem, because the constitution, what is it called? You have Kirchenstaatsrecht, church state law, and then you have constitution. It has to. There's two different names for the same body of law, but while the name was changed, it's never been amended to somehow accommodate non-Christian religions, because it's based on a Christian normativity. So the legal framework is actually highly problematic, and there's two law professors who actually work on this specific law in Islam, but there's none who's working on this specific law and Judaism. And Jews and Muslims don't fit into that specific law at all. It doesn't function. And the scholars those who deal with Islam are very aware of functioning, and those who deal with law and Judaism, even though there's no single person who really only does that, it's a law that was set up, I think, in 1913, and it's really based on the Christian normativity, so that doesn't quite work. But it hasn't been amended. There's no solution so far.
Time for one more question, and Dear Levkovich on Zoom, I'd like to ask a question.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Dani, for your interesting lecture. Rare to me to listen to one's own history. I'm second generation. I grew up in Germany. And I can tell you there's another anthropologist, i.e. me, Jewish and studied in Germany. But so there were two issues I wanted to raise. So one is the question of why so many people in the second, third generation, study law, become doctors. And you think, and my interpretation was always that post-Shoah, our parents were quite insecure in a way and couldn't really work for Germans. So they had to make sure they have independent businesses. And I always interpreted it that second, third generations are always at that point feel the same. They have to, have secure jobs and hence couldn't go into the arts or sociology, anthropology. That was my interpretation. And secondly, you mentioned the issue of the lawyers, of returning lawyers. So I'm the director of the Oral History Archive of German Jewish immigrants called Refugee Voices of the Association of Jewish Refugees. And in fact, I think you're absolutely right. There are many lawyers who went back. And I just recently interviewed Irene Auerbach, who is the niece of Philipp Auerbach. And her father was Walter Auerbach, who also returned with his family in 1946 to Germany. And he was a specialist in the trade union law and worked here in England, but then was quite important in Germany. So I think that this group is also important, the ones who wanted to build up Germany, who were socialists, who went to East Germany. And in fact, we know many Kindertransportees. Some of them went to build up East Germany. So in terms of remigration, I think that's an important point. That's it.
I agree with you. It's as well, it's the what you mentioned in regard to that the parents were insecure, and it's as well when you have those jobs, you can as well, because you're self-employed, you can always take your own holidays off. You don't have to tell anybody why you actually want the day off. So I agree with you. That's another dimension that plays into it. It's like freie Berufe, because then you actually get your own time off. And yeah, the rebuilding of East Germany by way of the Jews who returned, it's fascinating. And I think Jeff Pax and John Borman, I think they actually that's very insightful what they wrote in regard to East Germany. But the amount who went back was still rather small. And it's like, yeah, I think you're actually, but you left, you don't have a country anymore. I think besides me, it's only one of us, then there's one other. So it's like we're very few and in between. And how did your parents react to you becoming an anthropologist?
Yeah, they were not too excited.
Yeah, neither were mine. But my first degree is business. So it's like, I did something useful at one point in time. But I mean, they didn't have a clue. And I think the issue is, well, that plays into it is like the social and cultural capital was actually not particularly high. So this whole high of the German Jewish whatever elite, that might have been partially true before the Shoah, but afterwards, I mean, I don't think my parents actually knew what anthropology was. I'm not sure they understand it now, but they weren't excited. No. I'm with you on that.
No, I think it's exactly what you said. It's especially if you're a survivor, you come from Poland, Czechoslovakia, you come to Germany, it's not, you don't think that's something, familiar. You're not familiar with it. But yeah. I guess once you have a PhD, then it makes up for that. So that's okay once you have a PhD.
Yeah, for my grandmother it was. For her, it was like, she was saying, well, you never wanted to marry, but at least you have a PhD now. But she was a Berlin Jew. She had, her history is highly complicated, but it's very different from my mom who was then born in Poland. And it's all sorts of shit.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great. Well, I think that brings our discussion to a nice close. I should certainly bite our time as well. So please join me again. Thank you.
You're